Welcome folks. There's going to be a new series of training, educational series. I greet you, and we're going to be starting the history and the beginning of computers. What was actually the first computer? Some people may say the UNIVAC, the ENIAC. The Chinese will say the abacus, the first form of calculations. The Chinese used little beads, and then they used that for calculations. They had calculators with gears, big giant gears that they used to do addition. But these really were not the first computers. The first computer is actually the human brain. God created the first computer. The Creator created the first computer. Mankind learned from the human body and then start creating devices that will actually clone or copy them. For example, the Chinese, when they learned martial arts, how do you think they learned to fight the different skills? Did they look at the humans or they looked at the animals? They looked at the animals and they looked at their movements, like the tiger, the crane, the snake, the monkey style. All these things they took and they learned martial arts from it. So people took the human body and looked at how the body worked. And we know the memory, which is in your head, your brains, retain information, and we use your eyes to see information, and the information we use from our eyes, from our hands, the touch, from our tongue, the taste, from our nose, smell, and the ear, hearing. All these are called input devices. They get this information input into your CPU, which is your brain, your central processing unit. And from that, you analyze the data that comes in, and you output it. How do you output it? Well, somebody puts their hand out, that's an input. Your brain says, oh, put your hand out and shake their hands. That's a response. You actually hear some information, and you open it, and somebody says, good morning, and you respond, good morning. How are you? I am fine. How are you doing? These are input and output devices. But let's go back. These are the basic structures of computers that they learned from the human body and try to duplicate it in learning or creating computers. Now, the computer that they first made, they have two different models, the ENIAC and the UNIVAC. These computers, if you can imagine a big, huge warehouse, it was a big, giant warehouse, is what the first computers they made. And in these warehouses, the computer can only do 4 functions: add, subtract, multiplication, division. And each time they want to do a different function, they had to rewire the boards. You got to remember, in those days when they had these things, the technology was vacuum tubes. If anybody was around in the days of the first sets of TVs, the TVs inside, when you open the back, they had the fly back, and then they have the main board, and you see all these light bulbs inside. Actually, they're all different vacuum tubes with different types of voltages inside, and they did different functions. So all these light bulbs and these different things, the transistors, the resistors, the capacitors, was huge in those days. Alright, so all these things made the warehouse extremely big to create the first types of computer to do simple things like add, subtract, multiplication, division. All these things we know, people can get a watch, put it on their hands, and it does more functions than a whole giant warehouse. We have small calculators, but all these things are the basics of forming computers. So from there, they start creating smaller and smaller computer systems until we have computers very small that fits in the palm of your hand. All these technologies have changed through the years. But let's go back and we'll look at the beginning. When they created all these different machines, as time go by, as I said, they got smaller, they had to create languages to program these machines, because the basics of the computers understand what language do they understand? 1 and 0. Why does it understand 1 and 0? This is called machine language. Why is it called machine language? It's because this is the language of the machine. and it's ones and zeros. And why ones and zeros? It looks at where power is. When the power is on, like think of a light switch. When you put the light switch, it's 1 when you put it on. And when you turn it off, it's 0. On means current is going to it. Off means 0, no current to it. So all these programs that they used to write in machine language used to be long, long, long things. Like to do simple function, it may take you like 10, 12 paragraphs of code of 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. But the problems with this, when it came to deciphering, understanding it, it became a very tedious job. So they came out with assembly language, and then they start coming out with higher level. These are called, machine language is called low level language. And they create what high level languages, like for example basic language, COBOL, Fortran, then later on Pascal and C languages, Visual Basic as we know now, Flash, Java, all these different things as we got through time. But those were the basics of the old days. Now if you look back in the 70s, probably close to the 77, 78, they start coming out with little game machines. The Coleco came out with little Pong machines. These Pong machines, the graphics so basic. All they had is 2 sticks at the end and a square little ball that you hit and it bounces, and the other guy at the other end had to actually hit it. These are the basics of the first game machines that they came out with. Now, as they got on, they created more advanced machines. Osborne Scientific Computer, the VIC-20, the PET Commodores came out. These are all using languages like BASIC to program. High-level languages. BASIC had instructions like input, print, data, and if-then statements. Makes it more English things and easier for people to program. But behind the scenes, when they finish programming at a high level, they compile it, means they run it through a software, and it came down to ones and zeros. It always still comes down to ones and zeros. So these were how they used to communicate with the computers. They were just going to look at some of the old days of the history of the Commodore. There was two of the biggest dealers for computers was the Commodore computers and the Atari computers. And we had the IBMs came on the scenes way after. So the beginning we had these small machines, the Atari what they called the PET Commodore, which was called CBM. CBM was their name first, and they bought over Commodore Business Machines, which is CBM, bought the PET computer, and they became the first series of machines they had. And these machines were in, the screens were green, white, or yellow, amber. They're basically black and white computers, and their stuff was very basic, but they did more advanced structures, a lot of scientific formulas. They were able to compute, to create programs, create basic games. At the same time, the PET Commodore was out, the Radio Shack, you know, the Radio Shack stores had the Radio Shack computer. The Tandem, TSR-80s. TSR-80 was on the scene of the old days of using computers. They had the basic language, and they had the TSR-80 assembly language that was available. Actually, at that time, the Radio Shack was more advanced in programming wise for their application and their games than the PET Commodore. PET Commodore had some companies that were advanced in developing applications. They came later on and enhanced Commodore to make them more competitive, and more businesses was always buying these machines. All the high schools, companies, schools in St. Canada were using PET Commodore. So all they had a big contract, so they got in to the school boards, and the children were learning those back in the 70s. Prior to the 70s, in the 70s, prior to the Commodore hitting the school, I forgot, they used to use IBM mainframes. IBM was mainly in the mainframes, not in the micro. All the small Commodore computers, Atari, IBMs, microcomputers are just personal computers they call microcomputers. The mainframe were big, huge machines. And the schools used to use the mainframes, and they used to use something called card. They used to use cards, right? Little cards about that big to write your program. The first generation of cards, they used to use an HB pencil, the pencil, and you circle, you fill in the circle on the card, and you write your program on these cards through circles, instruction code, which was called JCL, Job Command Language. And from there, they used to send these jobs off to the universities and the big mainframe systems to run your program. You do your program, submit it, it takes a week to get it back, and you see if your program worked or didn't work. Then they eliminate on the cards the need for circling the pencil. They create a big device called the Keypunch device. You would actually type your program, and it will actually punch the thing out on the cards called Keypunch. You put the cards in, you go doop, and it comes out the other end punched. When we used to, at that time, it was JCL job language, and then they started introducing a language called COBOL. COBOL was a business-oriented language. And in COBOL, to write a simple procedure to print a message on the screen, you may need like 100 cards. 100 of these cards. So when the children was at school, they walk around with huge boxes full of cards. And if they fall in the hall and the cards out of sequence, they had to go and put them all back in sequence. But it was huge. Just imagine to write one little line. All of these in COBOL is a very lengthy language. So that's how these different languages evolved into the mainframes. And then, going back to the Commodore, Commodore, they came on the scene, which eliminated the Keypunch devices, got obsolete, the cards got obsolete. There wasn't need to use the mainframe systems anymore. They end up going now to micros, and they're designing programs they're teaching called business. Basic language. Basic language was used to teach people how to program. And you learned the devices on the small personal computers, the microcomputers. We're going to just talk a little bit about them to have a background. The old days, you have a screen and you have a keyboard. And the input device and the storage device, can you guess what that is? Most people can't guess. It was a tape recorder. And the regular cassette, which some people don't know what a cassette is, but these regular cassette, small things you used to store all your programs on. When you write your code, you use the save command, right? And then you save it onto, with a name, a file name, onto the cassette. Now when you want to bring it back the next day or 2 days, 3 days later, your program, you will use the load command, and you bring your program back from cassette. From cassette they used to use as the first. Right? Then they got more advanced, and then they came out with the big 8-inch floppy. There was a floppy with 8 inches, like the size of a paper. That's the second storage device, eliminating the cassette. Why do you think they eliminated the cassette? Do you know why they eliminated the cassette? Because the cassette was magnetic tape, and if you use it over and over, it gets thin, it gets stretches. If it goes in the heat or the sun, it melts, and you lose all your program and data. So they had to get something that was more stable, and they created the floppy diskette. And that was the first one, was basically an 8-inch, and then as they progressed through time, they came up with the 5 1/4 inch, and then they came up with the 3 1/2 inch floppy. These are the stages of the floppy diskette. Now the floppy diskette was interesting because with the floppy diskette, it was a square diskette, but inside was around like a record. They got the concept from the music of the LP, which is the records, of storing data on it, and have a turntable inside that will go spin around and retrieve data. The floppy was very successful. Going back one thing with the cassette, most people, if they have to erase the data, they usually either erase it with the program allow you to overwrite it, or they use a magnet. Magnet was used for magnetizing, because remember that the tapes were magnetic, so you use that to demagnetize it. But it also affected some floppies. People were demagnetizing the floppies. They kept them away from magnets as they would lose their data on it. But the nice thing with the floppies, the data lasted much longer. The only problem with the floppies is heat was the problem. Usage, if it gets too hot, it could melt. So this was a problem they still have to resolve. And as they resolved this issue, they came out with something called the hard disk. The hard disk replaced the floppies, which was the same concept as a floppy, except it was solid. Heat didn't affect it, and you can use it over and over. It was not made out of plastic. Right. This is using silicone, and the disc was it's more sturdy. So this is how the transgression from tape floppies to hard drive came. So now that's a little lesson of the how the generation changed from one technology to the next technology. Let's look at let's go back now to the Commodore. Commodore was so advanced, they came out with game machines. They said, okay, people at home love their games. Alright, they loved the game machine because at that time, what was going on was Intellivision came out with a great game machine. All these things were very $500, $600, $1,000 for a game machine, and people are playing games. And Atari came out with the Atari 2600, which was the Atari game machine, giving them arcade quality games that they could plug into their TV set and enjoy. So we had at that time the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and then we had, there was another company, Coleco. Coleco also came out with a game machine. Then Commodore had to get in the bandwagon, so Commodore came up with mixing a game machine with a personal computer called the Commodore VIC-20. The Commodore VIC-20 came out with 5K of memory. It was 5K of memory with the storage device as an option, a tape recorder for storage, and the only difference it had, it was color, whereas the PET Commodore was only black and white. So now they're entering to the personal computer field. The PET Commodore came out in close to $1,000 or $1,500 just for the machine, and I don't know, $500-600 for the tape recorder that plugged in. You couldn't use any regular tape recorder because they had a special interface cord that plugs in at the back of the unit. All these personal computers were plugged in through the RF signal through the back of the TV. And you turn it on and you played your games, load your games, buy your big games in cassette. Then eventually the Commodore replaced the VIC-20 with the Commodore 64 machine, which was more advanced. 64 meaning 64. The other one was VIC-20, was 5K, this was 64. Then they got replaced by the Commodore 128. Now, the same time this is going on, Atari also jumped on the bandwagon from the Atari 2600 game machine into the Atari 400 personal computer. The Atari 400 computer didn't have a regular keyboard. It was a membrane keyboard. But the games were much better than the VIC-20. They were actually, because Atari at that time was leading in the arcade world. The Atari had tons of arcade. They were into the Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and tons of asteroids. All these games, they were the leader of arcade games. So they brought the arcade quality games into the Atari 400. And the Atari 400 progressed into the Atari 800, then from the Atari 800 into the Atari 600 XL, 800 XL, and 1200 XL. but their machines had better quality. Unfortunately, Commodore still had the market. I think the reason why is because they're in the school system, and because of the school system, the children saw it, and they told their parents to buy Commodore. So that was the two biggest competition. IBM was not even a competition in the personal field. The IBM was only used into the business world. People buying, for example, we're going to talk about the IBM XT, the first generation, but they were like $10,000 for a basic XT at that time. So nobody at home is going to buy an XT, a black and white machine, to do business stuff on it for 10 grand. People are buying into the thousands of dollars from these Atari and Commodore. But just a little note off the side, there was other people too on the scenes, but the two major was Atari and Commodore. The other guys on the scenes was the Osborne Scientific Computer, the Sinclair had a 1K machine, the Interact computer all had